When we think about Italian performance in World War II, competent isn't exactly a word that comes to mind.
Now for the Italy, show no mercy, slaughter them like people know they're fighting advocates, we're really good, okay, Hitler, oh please help us now, my pants are soaked in hair.
Yeah, Italian army incompetence in World War II became a stereotype, and later a meme. But why were Italians so bad? And were they really that bad as it is often portrayed? On 2nd October 1945, fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia, then Abyssinia, and did not conquer the country until 5th May 1936, when Italian troops entered the capital of Addis Ababa. The Ethiopian War cost the Italians about 1,500 men. The Italian support to Francisco Franco during the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 cost the Italians 3,819 soldiers dead and 8.5 billion lira. The Italian military conquered the country of Albania in April 1939. While the conquest of Albania was a success, it exposed the problems that plagued the Italian army in the coming conflict. In Albania, the Italian military sent men who had never operated motorcycles to motorcycle companies. They sent men who did not even know Morse code to signal units. A member of Italian foreign minister, Siano's staff, commented about the Italian military's performance in Albania, saying, "If the Albanians had possessed one well-armed fire brigade, they could have driven us back into the Adriatic." By the time Hitler invaded Poland on 1st September 1949, Italy had driven away the gold it had collected from its citizens during the Ethiopian War of 1935 to 1936. This meant that Italy did not have enough gold to help finance a major conflict. These small conflicts, combined with the Spanish Civil War, debt would result in fatal consequences when Italy entered the war in 1940. The Italian military was not ready to go to the war by the time Mussolini declared war on France and Great Britain on June 10, 1940.
La dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori di Gran Bretagna e di Francia.
The fascist Italian military organization was so inept that the army, navy, and air force would frequently squabble, plot, and sometimes spy on one another activities. Dictator Benito Mussolini's belief that Italy was an unsinkable aircraft carrier, and his decision to place all of Italy's air power under the command of the Italian Air Force deprived the Royal Italian Navy of an air force and aircraft carriers. The Italian Navy became dependent on the Royal Italian Air Force for both long-range reconnaissance and air cover in its main battles in the Mediterranean. The Air Force would fail in their assigned duties at such battles as the Battle of Cape Spada and Battle of Calabria. The military command was flawed because promotion came as often by political favoritism as by military skill. Mussolini not only stifled debate in his military, but even fired one general on the spot for counseling him not to go to war, and he judged his military officers almost solely on fascist merits. The Royal Italian Army had a lack of uniforms and equipment, which badly compromised their battle readiness. The recruits usually were trained less than the required 18 months that was prescribed by Italian law. In 1940, the Royal Italian Army had rifles that dated back to 1891. Horse-drawn artillery, no heavy tanks, 70 medium tanks, and 1,500 light tanks that had armor that was so thin machine gun bullets could penetrate them. They were ill-equipped, ill-trained, and skeptical of fascism propaganda. In 1940, the Royal Italian Air Force only had 3,296 fighters and bombers, and they had neither the spirit nor the armament to match Allied fighters. The Royal Italian Navy's ships were also not equipped with radar, which would prove a fatal flaw in various battles to come. The Italian military would suffer numerous defeats in 1940 and 1941. The combination of lack of radar, lack of aircraft carriers, poor reconnaissance, and air support resulted in 1 out of 2 Royal Italian light cruisers being lost at the Battle of Cape Spada against the British Royal Navy in June 1940. The Royal Italian Army invaded Egypt on 13 September 1940. The British forces launched Operation Compass to counter the Italian invasion on December 9, 1940. By the time Operation Compass ended in February 1941, the British forces had pushed the Italians 500 miles back into Libya and then taken 130,000 Italians as prisoners. The Italians were rescued in North Africa when the Germans sent the Africa Corps, commanded by General Erwin Rommel. On 28 October 1940, the Italian army invaded Greece. By the end of December 1940, the Greek army drove the Italians out of Greece and were controlling more than 1/4 of Albania. Hitler decided in November 1940, in the immediate aftermath of Mussolini's invasion of Greece, to also invade Greece. This was not so much to bail out Mussolini, but to protect and to prevent British Royal Air Force bombers from bombing the Polesti-Romanian oil fields that were supplying his forces for the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union was initially scheduled for May 1941. Indeed, had Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in May 1941, the war in the East might have turned out differently. On 11 November to 12 November 1940, the British Navy launched an aircraft carrier raid on the Italian fleet at Taranto, Italy. This raid resulted in 3 battleships, 2 cruisers, and 2 destroyers being sunk or severely damaged. They were useless for months. The raid on Taranto also forced the Italian Navy to retire to Naples. This was too far to be a handcar against British convoys in the Mediterranean. In late March 1941, the British Royal Navy, using intelligence from Bletchley Park's Ultram and exploiting the Italian ship's lack of radar, fought the Battle of Matapan. Italy lost 3 cruisers, 2 destroyers, and 2,400 men. The defeat at the Battle of Matapan was so devastating for the Italian Navy that Mussolini ordered his fleet confined to waters under firm Italian control. Fascist Italy military also suffered a future defeat on 5th May 1941, when Haile Selassie and his British forces entered the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. There were 3 primary reasons for Italian inefficiency during the war. Firstly, Italy lacked the industrial capabilities of the great powers. Much of the country was seriously lacking economically, having been hurt by the Depression, although Italy actually recovered much faster than their neighbors, and having failed to mechanize. This resulted in industrial capabilities far reduced from those of the great powers. Lack of industrial capabilities was the most prevalent in aspects such as logistics and heavy equipment. Italian logistics was extremely bad, especially in early war. When General Graziani advanced into Egypt during Operazione E on 13 September 1940, he wasn't able to move further than 50 miles from the border with Libya. Italian logistics simply weren't ready to support the large advance throughout the desert. Worst at all, Graziani's force was basically unmechanized, and only mechanized group that he possessed was the Maglietti group, consisting of armored brigade of medium tanks and some light armor, accompanied by motorized infantry. The same logistical problems paralyzed the Italian advances in Greece. Secondly, Italy suffered from a strategic lack of experience. The country had had a relatively limited role in World War I, where so many generals of other nations had gained plentiful experience, and as such was deprived of a first-hand understanding of the factors involved in a modern European war. This resulted in a sort of dissonance between the military understanding of conflict and the reality of how the war played out. The experiences of Italian-Abyssinian War and Spanish Civil War made the Italians realize their strategic shortcomings. Italians thus created their own doctrine of war of rapid decisions. This doctrine put the importance on the use of small mechanized and motorized units that were accompanied by armor. The main goal of such units was to encircle and outmaneuver enemy units and then rapidly advance towards the strategically important objectives. It was in some sense the Italian version of German Blitzkrieg. On paper, it was brilliant, and actually in practice it had proven to be extremely successful during the March of Iron Will in Abyssinia and during the Spanish Civil War. However, during Operazione E and later Operation Compass, Italy did not possess a sufficient number of motorized units and logistical capabilities to use that doctrine. The logistical and industrial capabilities of Italy were not sufficient to make usage of such doctrine on the large scale possible. The third reason for the Italian failure was the poor training and performance of the officer corps. In the Italian army, the burden of training was placed on the individual companies. This resulted in a massive difference of performance of the troops in the same division. During the Battle of Tobruk, for example, Italian defensive positions in the south were able to stop the British advance effectively, while the Italian positions in the north and center effectively collapsed. The better trained companies were performing quite well on the tactical scale. However, it didn't matter at all on the strategic scale because the good units were simply being outflanked and encircled because the front collapsed in other places that were defended by the poorly trained companies. Also, Italian army leadership suffered from inadequately small NCO corps. The Duce decision to create more divisions by taking one regiment from the existing ones artificially expanded the officer corps. Since Italy already was suffering from the inadequate quantity of officers, inexperienced majors, captains, and sometimes even lieutenants were promoted to higher ranks, such as colonels and brigade generals, to fill the gap. This resulted in even worse performance of Italian leadership, since a big portion of the officer corps consisted of people who shouldn't have received the promotion to higher ranks. If you think that the situation couldn't be worse, then unfortunately you are wrong. The average turning time of the conscript amounted to 25 days. The Italian equipment was lagging behind in late 1930s. It is important to remember that Italy under Mussolini rearmed in the mid to late 1920s and very early 1930s, having come to power in 1922 versus Hitler, who came to power in 1933. Italian weaponry, like Soviet tanks at the beginning of Barbarossa, reflected the conventions of that era: tank kits and mixture of biplanes and monowing, open and closed cockpits, small anti-tank guns, primitive artillery fire control systems, ancient communication systems. By the time World War II really got going for Italy in the summer of 1940, almost all Italian equipment was obsolete, if not outright obsolete. See Italian tank kits. Italy, despite the great and partially successful efforts of fascist regime, was still a poor country with an underdeveloped industrial base and simply did not have the money, industry, or resources to update their out-of-date military gear. That failure soon caught up with them in the Western Desert in 1940, and the Italian armed forces, with the possible exception of their navy, simply did not have the men or equipment to survive on a modern World War II battlefield. Italy's greatest problem didn't lie in that they were incapable of modernizing their armament, when the reality of the situation kick in, they actually do that quite well for a country with such small industrial capabilities. The Italian cannone, the 9053, for example, is indeed the Italian pendant of the more famous German 88 flag, but I can assure the effectiveness is the same. With 90mm, this AA gun proved to be capable against AA crafts, and like its German brother, also extremely effective against ground targets, as an improvised 80 tank gun. And later on, the Italians also got the bright idea to mount them on a chassis and turn them into full-fledged tank destroyers. Obviously, the Italians observed what the Germans were doing with their Stuck series, and they also reorganized, apparently, utility of the assault guns. Adequately armored and with railway gun, those vehicles were deadly for anyone stupid enough to underestimate them, and I think that it speaks volumes that the Germans put them all into their receptors after the armistice, and generally appreciated their support whenever possible, as the so-called Sturmgeschütz M43 mid-7546, or formerly known as Samowenta da 7546. Also, some experts say the only piston engine XS airplane that was a match for the P-51D Mustang was an Italian fighter, the Machi C-205V Veltero. Italians also, despite having terrible light machine guns, created arguably the best submachine gun of World War II, the Beretta Model 38. Italy's greatest problem didn't lie in that they were incapable of creating new, good equipment and modernizing, but in their lack of industrial capability to produce all those new kinds of weapons on a large scale. Also, Italy, similar to Germany, suffered from an incredibly big deficit of oil. This resulted in the inability of Regia Marina to operate. If the Italians had enough oil to fuel their ships, then they might have defeated the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean Sea. British propaganda made the cowards out of Italian soldiers in World War II. However, nothing could be further from the truth. Virtually all of this propaganda is false. The Italians only broke and ran once. That was in the Western Desert in December 1940. The Italians set up armored camps, and the British went around the open flank. The Italians were thrown into a panic and fled, being far from their main supply base of Tripoli. Also, during Operation Compass, 75 of Italian POWs didn't speak Italian. They were the local Libyan colonial troops. Italian General Pietro Maletti, during Operation Compass, was killed outside his tent, firing a machine gun in his pajamas, trying to repel the British surprise attack and buy enough time for the surprise tankers of his unit to warm up the engines of their tanks. General Tellera, the highest ranking general in the 10th Army, was killed 2 months later inside a tank leading a breakout charge against the British. The Italians performed magnificently in Eritrea in 1941, smashing every British attack. In 1941, the Australians inside Tobruk were surrounded by the Italians while Roman's Panzer Corps moved on. They expected the same success as their predecessors in 1940. They didn't get it. The Italians would attack their outposts with flamethrowers. This was no different than the US burning up the Japanese alive on the Okinawa and Iwo Jima, only the Australians learned it before the Japanese. So horrible was this way to die that Australian troops started to refuse orders to man their defenses, while others shot themselves in the foot to get out of service. PTSD was so bad that the Australians had to set up an entire hospital section just for the cases. The first ever in history. Finally, the Austrians asked to be evacuated and were. They did not want to face the Italians for another day. By 1942, the Italians were accomplishing victories with the Ariete Trento divisions that wounded the German soldiers who had far superior armaments. This was accomplished via rapid ad hoc formations, normally gamble, but which they became very good at. In Tunisia, the Italian army was performing much better against the Anglo-Americans than the Vichy French. They held out until Rommel got behind the Maref line. Their performance in Sicily was adequate to their capabilities. There are countless other examples of the Italian bravery unmatched sometimes even by Waffen-SS units. Also, certain Italian units perform on a tactical scale in a manner that might be described as a miracle. The Italian 185 Paratroopers Division, Folger, is an example of such a miraculous performance. The finest and the darkest hour of the 185 came at the dawn of 23 October 1942, when Bernard Montgomery unleashed his accumulated might upon the German and Italian Afrikaners. Lost in his fevered dream for the Suez Canal and unable to see the reality at hand, Rommel had kept his combined forces where they had been stopped in July, unwilling to withdraw despite being positioned nearly 1,800 kilometers overland from Tripoli, his main supply port in Africa. Having the luxury of stable supply lines, Montgomery had accumulated 200,000 men and over 1,000 tanks, while the Axis Africaners wither on the vine. When the attack day came, the Italo-German Panzer Army had a total of 2 days' fuel in the entirety of its holdings east of Tobruk. Rommel could no longer fight the maneuver defenses he had been famous for. Once he had committed his reserves to counter British thrusts, he would no longer have the fuel to move them again. His reserves could move, but only once. In his blindness, Rommel had handed Africa to Montgomery on a platter, presenting him with a battle he could not possibly lose. It was under those circumstances that the Second Battle of El Alamein had begun. Even though Montgomery had placed his Schwerpunkt in the north, he had put noticeable emphasis in the south as well, for he knew, thanks to ultra-intelligence, the deployment of the Axis units, even though Rommel, knowing he no longer had the means of maneuver defense, had intercepted Italian and German units to stiffen up the front. The southern sector of the front was still primarily Italian, with only the Fallschirmjäger under General Major Hermann Bernhard Ramkel, and in the reserve the 21st Panzer Division commanded by General Major Heinz von Randolph. Montgomery knew that he would not have an easy victory in the southern sector, for it had been the site of the preliminary Operation Braganza nearly a month ago, which the Folgere had stopped cold. For this he had gathered 3 divisions, the 44th and 15th Infantry, and the famous 7th Armored along with the 1st and 2nd Free French and Royal Hellenic Brigades. Facing them were the Italian divisions Pavia Bologna and Brescia, a remaining brigade of German paratroopers, and of course Folgere. When the onslaught came, the Italians fought with utmost courage. Bologna presented redoubtable resistance, but was finally broken. Brescia held back the British armor until 4th November, and Pavia broke one day earlier. Ramke's paratroopers fought with all the tenacity and ferocity of the German Fallschirmjäger, ever unbreakable and ever unyielding. But this answer isn't about them, is it? No, we are talking about Folgere, and Folgere burned bright. It was Folgere that faced the bulk of the British offensive across the Musnasib Depression. Folgere was one of the luckier Italian divisions when it came to equipment, armed to teeth with modern weaponry such as Beretta Model 38 submachine guns and Beretta machine guns. But they lacked armor, transport or heavy artillery, and now they were facing 3 divisions and 3 brigades. the full might of the British in the southern sector. After the first attack by the 44th and the 7th had failed, now the British were sending all they had on the Italians, and those troopers laughed at it. Montgomery had believed the access in the southern sector would be completely broken within 12 days. For 12 days, the bulk of the Allied forces in the south bore down upon the Folger in fury and wrath, with heavy artillery and motorized vehicles and tank support. Yet they failed to break throughout. The paratroopers enfaddened them with 47mm anti-tank guns, stormed British tanks with Molotov cocktails and grenades, and repelled British infantry with furious counterattacks and close combat engagements. The British lost 120 vehicles and 600 men to the Folger division in their initial attack alone. Over the following days, they lost many more. Facing overwhelming odds, the men of the Folger refused to yield. Only on 6 November, when the paratroopers ran out of all ammunition, did the British dislodge and destroy the troublesome division. In the end, the division burned bright rather than fading away, much like its name, for they were the Folger Division, the Lightning Division. However, such miraculous performances were all wasted on a strategic scale. The Italian High Command had been plagued by corruption, nepotism, and political infighting. As such, Italians were the lions led by donkeys. And maybe in that fact alone lies the bitter truth about the Italian army in World War II. Rather than defeated by their foes, they were defeated by their own inadequate leadership, lack of industrial capabilities, logistics, and lack of oil, and other shortcomings. Italy simply entered the war with wrong foes at the wrong time, and at the same time absolutely unprepared for it. But why had Italy entered the war on the side of Germany? And why Italy declared the war despite being completely unprepared for it? Well, this is a matter for a separate video. Thank you for your attention, like and subscribe. Sempre avanti Italia, alla promessa volta con panago. Seriously, if the good military sayings were all that it takes to become the global superpower, then fascist Italy would probably be at the top.